Hey folks, welcome to another episode of ASP.NET Core from Zero to Overkill. In this episode, we'll play around with making things more object-oriented by using rich domain entities, or rich domain model, call it what you will. So in this episode, we'll be, in that regard, moving some domain logic that we have into entities. So we'll need to change the entities and the use case handlers as normally what we do, or at least in the projects I've gone through in the past, be it use case handlers or services, but all the logic is in there and the entities are simple bags of data. So we'll change that. And after doing these changes, we'll take a look at what is required for it to play nicely with the F-core, keeping in mind that until now the project is not very complex, so all of these changes won't be very complex. In more complex scenarios, some things might need some extra work. Before starting, just a quick heads up, I'll make some changes to the format of the series. In fact, I think it was already a bit that case, but I'll try even more right now. So these videos, the series videos, will become more of an overview of the changes that I'm doing in the project and the specific concepts, and less of live coding as it was in the beginning. So, but there will still be available videos with the development process, and probably even better than before. So I'm trying to stream on Twitch once a week. I probably will fail a lot of times to do it once a week, but that's what I'm trying right now. So basically on those streams, I prepared the code for the next episodes. Maybe not always the same, but right now the plan is that to prepare the next episode's code during the stream. And if you aren't able to watch the live stream and want to take a look at that development process and see me struggle and making a ton of mistakes, even more than during this series, I archive the streams to YouTube. So there's a playlist called Stream Archive, and everything I put in there. But the Twitch stream is interesting because if you are able to attend, you can ask questions and probably even correct me when I do stupid stuff. So you can have a say in the code that ends up in this series. So that's interesting. But if not, because time zones or availability and all of that, I still store everything on YouTube. But the goal is for the series video to become smaller and more focused, and all the other things that might be interesting but not to everyone will go onto the streams. So let's see. I've been trying to make the videos smaller for a long time and failed miserably. So let's see if I can do it right now. So with that said, the usual plugs. So if the videos are being useful, please consider liking, sharing, and leaving feedback. The third one is the most important, but the other ones are of course very helpful to improve the channel. And for more stuff, remember each video normally comes, at least in the series, comes with a blog post. You can reach out with doubts and stuff like that on Twitter. Like I mentioned, you can also go to Twitch to check out the live streams and the stored past streams on YouTube. And for alternative contacts, you can visit the blog or my personal website, and I have more contacts in there. So with all of that out of the way, let's get started. So let me just back to the list of things to do. So we'll get back to some links later, but right now let's go to the code. So the application is not very complex right now, so the focus will be on the group entity, which is where our main thing so far. The group management API basically is just groups right now. It will change eventually, but I keep coming up with episodes always focusing on the same thing. So this is already changed, like I mentioned. If you want to see me doing all these changes, check out the stream, the past streams playlist. But let's take a look at the original version of this. And it's this one. So let me do this here. Where is it? No arrow? Oh, it is. So this was the original version, and like you see, it was the typical thing I saw in past projects. Almost always it's like this. The entities are just bags of data with getters and setters, and all the logic ends up in the services and whatnot. So these were just this, and if we want to update the name, for instance, all the logic would be on the update group handler. And let's see the original version. Where's the arrow? Over here. So if we go here, we have all the logic in here, and change the name. Our row version, forget about this, it's because of the optimistic concurrency, but the important part is checking for the user being an administrator and changing the name. Everything was done in the handler. And another thing is, if we go to the create group handler, let's see the original code, and it's basically, as always, creates a new group and sets the entities like this. So it must know what entities, what properties of the entity it needs to set, and all of that. And then it needs to know that the creators should also be added as a group user to make the relationship, and so on. So all the logic is in the services, in this case the handler, which is the service per use case. So this is not really very object-oriented, at least in my opinion, because this is something I've been thinking about a bit in the past, is that, I don't know about you folks, but I learned about object-oriented programming in university, and what we were taught was that the object should encapsulate data and expose behavior to manipulate said data. And what we end up doing right now is having services that just change properties, and the objects are just, all of them are DTOs. So there's no problem with DTOs, and there's no problem with having some procedural code, which is what the default way we are doing things is. There's no problem, particularly in simple scenarios, but in more complex implications, actually taking advantage of the object-oriented approaches is good. And alternatively functional, but we are using C#, so we are more focused on object-oriented with some sprinkles of functional here and there. So let's make this code a bit more object-oriented by making the classes actually encapsulate the data and expose behavior to manipulate said data, instead of having everything in services. So just a quick recap: show history, the original version, just properties with getters and setters. So this changes right now. Of course, I've changed it already, and let's start with the properties. We'll see the rest later. But basically, the important part is now the setters are all private, no setters available. And not only that, but for instance, the group users, which was just an I collection that could be changed from outside, now it is exposed as an I read-only collection, and simply returns a backing field as read-only. So outside, it can't be changed. If we just use a normal I collection, even if we just had a getter, we could still change the collection. So it wouldn't be enough. We need to make an I read-only collection to make sure nobody outside changes it and encapsulate the data. So all of these properties cannot be changed from outside the group class. There are other private setters or completely read-only. So then we have the group users backing field, which is actually a list, so we can change it. It's just not possible to change it from outside the group class. So we are encapsulating the data and controlling the access to it. Then we are exposing a group constructor that says to create a group, we need this information. So we need the name for the group and we need a creator of the group. We enforce some rules. We need the name to not be null or empty or white space, same thing. Otherwise, throw argument null exception. And basically the same for creator. We need a creator. If we don't get the creator, it's an error. So we set the properties, and that logic that before needed to be done inside the services or handlers, now it's internal. So when creating a group, we know that the creator must be added to the group users list. In this case, we're doing it as a new administrator. We can check this method from group user. It's following the same approach. So the group user has a constructor that exposes the properties it needs. In this case, I'm using the IDs, probably not the prettiest thing and probably against some DDD guidelines, but right now let's go with it. So get the group ID, user ID, and the role. We could call this directly from the group, but I felt like just creating some helper factory methods to make it really clear what we are doing. So by creating a method new administrator, we know what kind of user we will get. And the same for a new participant. In this case, it's not used yet, but we could also call this directly. And I have this public, but it could be private because it's only called from the factory methods. But for now, let it be like this. Probably in the future I'll change it. So that's it for this. This class is really simple. So in the group, in the constructor, we add a new administrator like this. Pretty simple method with a great name, easy to understand. This private constructor will see why in the future this is here. And now, so right now, because the API is really simple, we are exposing just a couple of operations, which is create a group and update group details. And right now, the only details a group has is basically its name. So really simple stuff. So the create group is taken care of by having the constructor with the information it needs. And for the update details, the information, what is needed is a rename method. So of course we could just make this public, but like that we not only couldn't enforce some rules that we need, and we're making things, again, discarding the logic from in here and putting it elsewhere where it makes sense, is being in the entity. The entity should be responsible for keeping itself valid and having the logic to manipulate its data. So by having a rename, we can enforce that the user, we receive the user that's editing the group, and the new name that we desire for the group. Then we can have some helper methods like this one. As you see, I have some to-dos here because I want to get rid of all these exceptions, but for now, good enough. And we have this helper method to check if a user is an administrator of a group. So in this case, we are enforcing that only administrators can rename the group. And instead of having that logic somewhere else, the group knows that it only wants to be edited by an administrator. And then, again, enforcing that the new name must be not empty. So this would be all outside. And another thing, maybe not a lot too much relevant, but I think it's interesting, is that the name is rename. It is not set name. This would be, yeah, it would work the same way, but rename makes it clear. It's a group that already exists and we are renaming. So it's interesting to, I think, to have this kind of care with naming things. So it makes reading the code easier, I guess. So these are the changes, because it's simple entity, so simple changes, but I think it's helpful to understand this and apply to bigger entities. So we saw group user, it's just that relationship entity. Now let's see, for the create group, all the code is basically the same. What changed is that now instead of creating a group and setting the properties by hand, we create a group using a constructor, and the constructor tells us what properties it needs. So we cannot make a mistake as easily as if we just had needed to create a new instance and set some properties, because we wouldn't know if we need to set the ID or the row version or all of that. Like this, we know exactly what we need to give it to the group, and all the other responsibilities are taken care of. In this case, for instance, the ID and the row version are taken care at the database level. So for create, the change, really simple, just calling the constructor. For update, the change is also simple. We got the group, and now we want to rename it. So we call group.rename, give it the current user for it to make sure the user is authorized, and give it the new name that the current user asked for the group to be renamed to. And all the rest is the same. We grab the group, grab the user, and then after renaming, we update the group in the repository. But the rest of the code is all the same. So pretty simple changes. Let me just get back here. So we saw these changes, really simple. Good thing the current project is still simple, because it makes it easier to understand these things, and then it's just to extrapolate how to do this in a bigger code base. So now let's take a look at how all of these changes play nicely with EF Core, which is what we are using to persist the data. So I skipped it in a minute ago, but now we'll take a look at this private group, why we are using this. So EF Core is able to create the instance even if using this kind of constructor, as long as the constructor doesn't have a navigation property. So let's take a look here at the docs. So EF Core supports entity types with constructors. So as long as the constructor parameter names match the properties, this will work. What it doesn't work, let me see, is with navigation properties. So because it doesn't work with navigation properties, and this user creator is a navigation property for the user table, EF cannot use this constructor. So I created this private constructor with no parameters, and even though it's private, EF core is able to use it because reflection doesn't care about private, public or anything. So it is able to find that there is this parameterless constructor, and then by having these private sets, it can set all the properties. If, for instance, the creator is set over here, so at first glance we could remove this, but if we remove the setter, then EF core isn't able to set anything. So we make a private setter. At least last time I checked, it can't do it. But with a private setter, it is able to set it. So that's why we have all these private setters, to allow EF to create a new instance of the class and then set everything. Now, another thing is this group users, which is an I-read-only collection, so, and without a setter. So how does EF core put the data in there? So if you remember, you have this navigation, this backing field, and looking at the docs, we have some information about backing fields, and EF core is able to write directly to backing fields. And in the most simple scenario, like is this case, by having the field follow some convention, and in this case underscore camel cased property name, EF core is able to find that backing field and put data in there, because that's exactly it. The property is group users and the field is camel case group users with an underscore. So EF core automatically finds things, and I didn't need to change any configuration. But if I needed, so if this had another name, we could go to the configuration and say this. So entity blog has a property URL and has field validated URL. So in this case, I didn't need to do this because I'm following the conventions. But if we want to have things with different names, we can do this. And check out these docs if you have more questions about this, because there's a lot of types of configurations that can be done. But for the simple scenario we have right now, that's how all of these works. So, and that's why I need this private constructor here and these private sets over here. And with this, I didn't need to change anything in the configuration for the entity, so no need for migrations. If you take a look at the code for this episode, you'll see changes in the migrations, but it's not related to this. It's just because I enabled nullable reference types in the project, and it changed some things, which means I was doing something wrong, because I forgot to set things that might or might not be null in the database. So that's the reason there are changes in the migrations. Nothing is due to these changes. Everything here works exactly the same with the same database structure. So having that entity, let me go local history. Oh, nope. Local history, show history. So this thing here or the other thing in terms of database, it's the same, no change. It's just we move the logic from the services to over here. Now, one other thing you might be thinking is that's a bit annoying that we need to take in consideration this, having this private constructor and all of that because of entity framework when we are in the domain project, we shouldn't have to worry about that. So that would be great. That would be the perfect world. But we need at some point to persist things. We have some choices. One of them is to do it like this. So to do small tweaks to accommodate for the technology that we are using. For instance, in this case, EF Core could be an Hibernate, whatever. Alternatively, we could try to keep this as pure as possible. But at some point, we would need to put a way to get things from persistence, even if we were just doing queries by hand, like writing the SQL. At some point, we would need to pass in the information to the class, and using this constructor wouldn't be enough. So maybe we would need to create like a public group method, like from persistence, and put here all the data. Maybe we would need to do something like that. But in some place we need to be able to transpose what we have in the database into the object. The way to do it depends. In this case, I prefer it because there isn't a lot of noise, like having a private constructor in these private sets. It's not a lot of garbage inside this class just to make it work with EF Core, so it doesn't bother me. But it's a trade-off. You need to choose the way to do it, but in some place you'll need to do it. Okay, so I think that's it for the topics. Hopefully this is a shorter episode, but every time I think it's a shorter episode, I go and see that the final video is like half an hour or more. But just to wrap up, the focus of this episode was really object-oriented programming and splitting things up better and making use of classes with their public APIs, encapsulated fields, and all of that. But every time I talk about this, DDD comes to mind, so domain-driven design. So yes, some concepts over here are from domain-driven design, but mainly because domain-driven design literature is very focused on object-oriented programming languages. So you can implement it in functional language, but at least most of the things I read is object-oriented. So it makes sense that they use the object-oriented practices to implement domain-driven design, and so entities, value objects, and all of that are implemented using these kinds of ideas, which makes sense. So, but I'm not going still on domain-driven design. I may use some concepts from there, but that wasn't the focus for this episode. So, but if you are really interested in that, there are tons of resources, books, videos, and all of that. But some interesting starting points might be Julie Lerman's blog, or Courses in Plural site, or Steve Smith also blogs a lot about that, and for instance has a Course in Plural site with Julie Lerman. Another great resource for these kinds of concepts is the blog from Vladimir Korikov, and also Plural site courses and all of that. So you have a lot of places to go to. It wasn't my focus, but it's where you can take a look if you want to take in more information about DDD. So I guess that's all. And that's it for this episode. Remember, if you want to see more live coding and stumbling upon, take a look at Twitch or the stream archive. And that's it. I hope to see you in the next one. See yous!